Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 411. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. Today joined by co-host Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing?
Doing well, Kyle. How are you?
Doing well, Connor. Happy to have you back on today. We got a lot of news to talk about. The first thing I want to mention, of course, is please share the show. If you can, recommend it to somebody, put it on your favorite social media, wherever it is. We're hosted at the Libertarian Institute. You can find us on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee for the video version of the show. And Connor, how can people follow you?
I'm at Freeman's Mind 96 on Twitter. And then, we run everything that Kyle, myself, and Will do. The great Will Porter at con_interest on Twitter as well.
All right, Connor, let's get into the news today. The first article I have here is by Dave DeCamp. It's Representative Thomas Massey working against TikTok ban and restrict ads. So doing some heroic work here. Representative Massey is urging Republican leadership not to pursue legislation designed to ban TikTok, the video sharing app owned by the Chinese company ByteDance. In comments to Axios, Massey expressed opposition to the Resist Act, a piece of legislation introduced in the Senate that he has received more than 20 bipartisan co-sponsors and is supported by the White House. The bill doesn't mention TikTok, but would give the Commerce Secretary sweeping powers to crack down on tech. This is what Massey said. I've communicated very politely to our leaders that if you ever try to bring a bill like that here, we're going to have more than problems in this chamber. Massey, the libertarian-leaning Kentucky congressman, said as a part of the not just libertarian but populist revolt against the Restrict Act, Massey called the legislation an excuse to grow government to give them the power to judge and jury, and he had no affinity for TikTok, but the cure is worse than the disease. And I do hope that it is a populist bloc forming against this bill, Connor, because certainly the populists tend to be the most anti-Russia or anti-China, members of the House. And so if Massey has these people on board, then it does cover his right flank quite a bit. So let's move on here. U.S. to sell Taiwan about 400 Boeing-made Harpoon anti-ship missiles. Taiwan will purchase 400 Boeing-made Harpoon anti-ship missiles under a contract worth $1.7 billion, Bloomberg reported on Monday. Taipei has previously produced ship-launched Harpoons, which are also made by Boeing, but the new deal is for the ground-launched mobile version of the anti-ship missile. According to Bloomberg, the sale will complete a deal approved by Congress in 2020. The Pentagon announced a $1.7 billion contract with Boeing on April 7th, but wouldn't say what the deal was for, but it was with Taiwan. The Harpoon deal has been cited by Congress as a part of what they call a $19 billion backlog in arms sales to Taiwan, although the weapons purchased typically take years to fulfill. So it's, unclear when the weapons will get there, but, they do say they're coming now, Connor. And of course, this takes us further away from the one China policy that has governed the U.S. Beijing relationship and, of course, puts us closer to war. We've had a lot of military officials, high-ranking officers make very provocative statements about China over the past couple of years. And we have another one here now from Admiral John Aquiliano, the commander of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, and he told Congress on Tuesday that the U.S. must be ready to fight and win the war against China over Taiwan. He said, I'm responsible for finding a way to prevent this conflict today, and if deterrence were to fail, to be able to fight and win. The comments are the latest example of the U.S. military officials speaking openly about the fact that they're pursuing a war against China or preparing for a war against China. The U.S. Army Secretary Christine Wormuth also said recently that the U.S. must be ready to beat China in a war in the Asia-Pacific by beefing up its military presence in the region. The commander of the U.S. Indo-Pacific forces pushed back against other military leaders who have tried to predict when China might attack Taiwan, saying they were just guessing. His predecessor, Admiral Philip Davidson, said in 2021 that China could invade in the next 6 to 10 years. Other people have said it could be far closer, and the U.S. is ramping up the war games. This article here, House China Committee to War Game a Chinese Invasion of Taiwan. The new House panel on China will be wargaming a Chinese invasion of its Taiwan to explore ways the U.S. can respond to the latest example of a U.S. government preparing for a future conflict with Beijing. Connor, I think something else really important about this is that, these war games will be used by these members of Congress to say, okay, now we have to buy these military systems because, the war game showed us that we have deficits in our Navy or in our missiles. And so this is going to be probably their new excuse to fund more weapons research and procure even more weapons. And the last article that I have today, U.S. Australia to hold largest ever Talisman Saber military exercise. The U.S. and Australia will hold their largest ever iteration of their bilateral military exercises, which take place every 2 years. This is the 10th iteration of the war games, and they will be held from July 22nd to August 4th and will involve 30,000 troops. Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, Fiji, Indonesia, Togo, France, Britain, Canada, and Germany will also participate. Representatives from the Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand will attend as observers. This is Brigadier, I'm guessing, General Damien Hill, an Australian officer directing the drills, said Talisman Saber 23 will be the largest ever iteration of the exercise, both in terms of geographic span and also partner nation involvement. This year's exercise will demonstrate our ability to receive large volumes of personnel equipment into Australia from across the Indo-Pacific and stage it, integrate it, and move them forward in a large-scale exercise area. The plans for the massive exercises come as the U.S., Australia, Britain unveiled their plans under the AUKUS military pact, which will ultimately be the ultimate goal of Australia being able to produce nuclear-powered submarines in the 2040s. The U.S. Navy envisions AUKUS will turn Australia into a full-service marine hub for the U.S. and its allies in the region, with operations targeted at China. So, Connor, plenty of provocations targeting Beijing, and I'll hand it over to you to talk about some news from the Middle East.
Yeah, absolutely. I think CNAS will have some suggestions about which weapons that the Pentagon can buy, especially since they're funded by Northrop Grumman and Lockheed and Raytheon and Boeing. But anyway, moving to the Middle East, we've got this piece from Dave DeCamp on April 13th. Saudi push to bring Syria back into Arab League faces some resistance. So we were covering all this momentum to bringing Syria back into the fold last week. There are some knuckle draggers still, particularly we're talking about Qatar, Kuwait, and Morocco. So let's get into the piece. Saudi Arabia's push to bring Syria back into the Arab League is facing resistance from a few countries, the Wall Street Journal reported last Thursday. The report named Qatar, Morocco, and Kuwait as opposing normalization between Syria and the Arab League, which suspended Damascus in 2011. Qatari Prime Minister Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdulrahman Al Thani publicly expressed opposition to the idea on Thursday. There were reasons for the suspension of Syria from the Arab League and the boycott of the Syrian regime in that time, and these reasons still exist, he said. Qatar's individual decision is not to take any step if there is no political development or solution to the crisis, which sounds like he wants to see regime change, much like Washington. And according to the journal, the Arab states that oppose the normalization are making demands of Damascus, including, quote, calls that Damascus accept Arab troops to protect returning refugees, crack down on illicit drug smuggling, and ask Iran to stop expanding its footprint in the nation. But overall, regional countries are accepting that Syrian President Bashar al-Assad isn't going anywhere, and they're continuing to upgrade ties with his government. Despite the opposition from these few Arab states, the Saudis seem determined to move ahead as they hosted Syria's foreign minister last Wednesday for the first time since 2011. And picking up on that, this story from this week, we had Assad meet with the Saudi Arabian foreign minister in Damascus. So this is the next one from Dave DeCamp on April 18th. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad hosted Saudi Arabia's foreign minister in Damascus on Tuesday, in the latest sign that Riyadh is ready to normalize diplomatic relations with Syria, which have been suspended for more than a decade. Saudi Foreign Minister Prince Faisal bin Farhan's trip to Damascus marked the first high-level Saudi visit to Syria since 2011, when Riyadh threw its support behind the failed regime change effort against Assad. The Saudi Foreign Ministry said bin Farhan's trip showed Riyadh's desire to find a solution to the conflict in Syria that would preserve the country's Arab identity and return it to its Arab surroundings. Also on Tuesday, Syria's foreign minister visited Tunisia on a trip to restore diplomatic ties with the African country, which also severed relations with Damascus back in 2012. Of course, CIA Director William Burns recently visited Riyadh and told the Saudis that Washington was quote, blindsided by their steps to upgrade ties with Damascus and normalize with Iran. The U.S. prefers to keep Syria isolated and crushed under crippling sanctions, but more and more regional countries are accepting that Assad isn't going anywhere. The Wall Street Journal reported in March that Arab countries were looking to work out a normalization deal with Assad, which would involve Saudi, Jordan, and other U.S. allies lobbying for an end to the Western sanctions on Syria, which would be the best outcome out of all this, considering how devastated the population is there in Syria, with 90% of their people living below the poverty line. Okay. Now, this next piece is from the Cradle. The news desk there on April 17th. Iran has invited the king of Saudi Arabia to visit Tehran. So Iran officially invited Saudi Arabia's king to visit Tehran, an Iranian foreign ministry spokesperson said on Monday, after the two Islamic rivals agreed to reestablish relations after years of hostility due to a China-brokered agreement on March 10th. And just over a week after the agreement was inked, Iran and Saudi Arabia invited Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi for an official visit, an invitation the Saudi monarch is now reciprocating. Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi has sent an invitation to the Saudi king in return for an invitation by Riyadh for him, Iranian spokesperson Nasser Kanani told a televised news conference. Technical delegations from both countries are preparing to officially reopen their missions, and Tehran said these missions would restart their activities by May 9th. Kanani stated further that fortunately we have taken positive steps. The officials of the two countries have welcomed the technical delegations very well. The political relations between the two countries have been practically restored. Riyadh cut relations with Tehran in 2016 after Iranian protesters attacked Saudi diplomatic missions following the Saudi execution of Shia cleric Namir al-Namir. However, both sides have long been engaged in proxy wars in Iraq and Syria, with Iran supporting the Iraqi and Syrian governments against al-Qaeda-led insurgency supported by Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, and, of course, Israel, the United States, under the supervision of the CIA. And ISIS was among those insurgent groups enjoying Saudi backing. The reconciliation between Saudi Arabia and Iran has also led to improved relations between Saudi Arabia and the Ansar Allah resistance movement in Yemen. A peace deal in Yemen between the Saudis and the Houthis is currently being negotiated to end the war, which has killed hundreds of thousands and caused the world's worst humanitarian crisis since its start in 2015. More on Yemen in a minute, but first, there's this new story that just came out today, and I'm going to cover this is from Al Jazeera. So Iran says its Navy forced a U.S. submarine to surface in Gulf waters. So last week we talked about how the U.S. had announced that they had deployed this guided missile submarine to the Middle East. And they were bragging about that a spokesperson from the Fifth Fleet boasting about how it's got what was like nearly 150 Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles, and it was all meant to just menace Iran and increase tensions. But now, so we have an Iranian official saying today that Iran's Navy obliged the submarine to surface as it entered the Gulf, quote, violating its border in the latest report of an apparent confrontation between Iranian and U.S. forces in the region. Quote, the U.S. submarine was approaching while submerged, but the Iranian submarine Fateh detected it and carried out maneuvers to force it to surface as it went through the Strait of Hormuz. It had also entered into our territorial waters, but it corrected its course after being warned, Navy Commander Shahram Irani told state television on Thursday. This submarine was doing its best, using all its capacities to pass in total silence and without being detected, Irani said. We will certainly reflect to international bodies the fact that it had violated our border. Earlier this month, the U.S. Navy said the nuclear-powered submarine Florida, equipped with a guided missile system, was operating in the Middle East in support of the Fifth Fleet based in Bahrain. Washington denied the Iranian naval commander's claims in a statement released via Twitter by the U.S. Navy, which said, Iran's claim is absolutely false. A U.S. submarine has, in all caps, not transited the Strait of Hormuz recently. The claim represents more Iranian disinformation that destabilizes the region. U.S. Fifth Fleet continues to operate wherever international law allows, the statement read. In early April, the Iranian Navy said that it identified and warned off a U.S. reconnaissance plane outside the mouth of the Gulf. In 2021, U.S. and Iranian warships had a tense encounter in the Gulf waters when a ship commanded by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps cut in front of the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Monomi, causing the U.S. Coast Guard vessel to come to an abrupt stop with its engine smoking. And of course, this just comes off the heels of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, declaring that the U.S. will begin directly targeting the IRGC in Syria, especially, as he said, very harshly over time. So indicating that there could be a major eruption or potentially a war with Iran coming up soon. But in any case, the tensions are skyrocketing in the region right now. At the same time that there's this real push towards normalization and a regional realignment going on with Iran and Syria being brought back into the fold. The Americans and the Israelis are just escalating because they don't know what else to do. Okay, so this is so now some Yemen news that we're going to cover. This goes back to April 9th. So this is the Saudi delegation arrived in Yemen for talks with Houthis on ending the war. And this is from Dave DeCamp. So a Saudi delegation arrived in the Yemeni capital of Sana'a to negotiate with the Houthis, as multiple reports have indicated a peace deal between the warring sides is near. Omani officials arrived in Sana'a over the weekend. This is about 12 days ago. So Omani officials arrived in Sana'a over the weekend, too, as Muscat has been brokering talks between the Saudis and the Houthis. According to the Houthi media, the head of the Houthi Supreme Political Council, Mahdi al-Mashat, would meet with the Saudi and Omani envoys to discuss ending hostilities and lifting the blockade. The Houthis' main demands for a peace deal have been a complete lifting of the blockade that the U.S.-backed Saudi-led coalition has imposed on Yemen since 2015. They also want government salaries to be paid using revenue from Yemeni oil and gas exports. Sources told Reuters that the Saudi-Houthi talks will focus on fulfilling these conditions. The Saudis and the Houthis reached a ceasefire agreement last year, which lasted from April of 2022 until October. While the ceasefire has technically expired, there have been no Saudi airstrikes in Yemen or Houthi attacks inside Saudi Arabia. Now, a source from the Saudi-backed Yemeni government told AFP on Saturday that the Saudis and the Houthis have agreed in principle on a 6-month truce to pave the way for 3 months of talks on establishing a 2-year, quote, transition that would lead to a permanent settlement. Other media reports have said that a deal should be reached soon, including one from Al Mayadeen, which said that the Saudis will announce an end to the war. March 25th marked the 8th anniversary of the U.S.-backed Saudi-led war in Yemen. Since then, at least 377 people have been killed in the war, per the UN's numbers, and more than half of whom died due to starvation and disease, which was caused directly by the blockade and the coalition's brutal bombing campaign against civilian infrastructure. And again, according to the UN, more than half of those victims are babies and children under 5 years old. So this next piece is from April 11th. Progress in Saudi-Houthi-Yemen peace talks in Sana'a. So progress has been reported in the Oman-brokered Saudi-Houthi talks that are ongoing in Sana'a, as a ceasefire agreement is expected to be reached soon. The Saudis' envoy to Yemen, Mohammed bin Zayed al-Jaber, is leading the delegation in Sana'a. He arrived in the city on Saturday, as did the Omani officials mediating the talks. On Monday, al-Jaber said on Twitter he was visiting Sana'a, quote, with the aim of stabilizing the ceasefire, supporting the prisoner exchange process, and discussing ways of dialogue between the Yemeni components to reach a comprehensive and sustainable political solution in Yemen. Moammar el-Irani, the information minister for the Saudi-backed government, welcomed the talks and wrote on Twitter that the atmosphere is more ready than ever to achieve peace. Hans Grudenberg, the UN Special Envoy for Yemen, said Tuesday that he was encouraged by the, quote, depth and seriousness of the engagement between the Houthis and the Saudis. While the UN isn't involved in the current negotiations, it expects to be involved in negotiations toward a permanent political settlement. The initial ceasefire deal will include a full lifting of the blockade, which will bring much-needed relief to the people of Yemen. Okay, so then Jake Sullivan spoke with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. So this is from the 12th. From Dave DeCamp, Jake Sullivan discusses Yemen peace talks with Saudi Crown Prince. So National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan spoke with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman on Tuesday about the ongoing Saudi-Houthi peace talks aimed at ending the war in Yemen. According to the White House, Sullivan, quote, welcomed Saudi Arabia's extraordinary efforts to pursue a more comprehensive roadmap for ending the war. He said the U.S. was sending its special envoy to Yemen, Tim Lenderking, to the region to support the peace process. Lenderking was appointed by Biden in 2021 to work toward a diplomatic solution in Yemen, but the current peace talks that are showing progress are being mediated by Oman. Saudi and Omani officials are currently in the Yemeni capital of Sana'a, holding talks with the Houthis that are expected to result in a ceasefire agreement to pave the way for a long-term political settlement. The Biden administration, of course, could have pressured Riyadh to make a deal with the Houthis much earlier by cutting off military support, but instead the White House successfully pressured Congress not to vote on a war powers resolution that would have ended U.S. support for the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen. Okay. Now, this next piece is from the 17th, again from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. The Saudis release more Houthi prisoners. Relief ships are docking in Hodeidah. So the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen on Monday released more Houthi detainees as part of a unilateral prisoner release as the prospect for a peace deal between the warring sides continues to grow. According to AP, a spokesman for the Saudi-led coalition said that 104 Houthi detainees have been released. The step comes a day after the Houthis and the Saudi-backed government completed a swap that freed over 900 people, including 700 Houthis, as well as Saudi and Sudanese troops. Also on Sunday, the Cradle reported that 3 ships carrying hundreds of containers of food and commercial goods had docked in Yemen's Red Sea port of Hodeidah. The Saudi-Houthi peace talks that have been taking place have focused on lifting the blockade on Yemen, which has been implemented since 2015. Houthi and Saudi officials held these Omani brokered negotiations in Sana'a last week. No deal has been agreed upon, but the Houthis say the talks will continue after the Muslim holiday of Eid al-Fitr, which is being celebrated today and tomorrow. As Yemen peace efforts have made progress, Biden has sent high-level officials to the region, including Brett McGurk, the top Middle East official on the National Security Council. According to the White House, during meetings between U.S. and Saudi officials, the U.S. side, quote, confirmed its support for the defense of Saudi Arabia against threats from Yemen and elsewhere, signaling the administration is willing to support Riyadh in its war if the peace process fails. All right, so we're going to move on to what's been going on with Israel, because right now, there's all kinds of factors at play in the drastic escalations we've seen, particularly in Syria and also against the Palestinians over during Ramadan. There were at least 2 notable brutal attacks on the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Of course, Netanyahu is dealing with all the protests going on right now against his judicial reform. His coalition is filled with all these far-right religious ultra-Zionist fanatics who really want to just annex the West Bank, and they don't care if it starts a major war. And we're seeing a real escalation in the bombings of Syria, and they've bombed Lebanon and Gaza as well in the last couple of weeks. And so it's looking more and more like Israel is just refusing to accept, as I said earlier, much like the Americans, this regional realignment. And instead of enacting policies that could help, for them to adjust, I know that China has offered recently, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more, to help negotiate a peace deal between the Israelis and the Palestinians. I think we all know that there won't be any real outcome from that, since Israel will just not accept anything close to giving the Palestinians their rights and their land back. So there's a great analysis here by Jonathan Cook, originally a Middle East Eye, and we're running it at antiwar.com today. But he does a great job of covering all the different factors at play here right now. And it does appear that Netanyahu may be getting ready to start a war, and especially to distract attention from his corruption trial and all of his domestic problems. So I'm just going to run through this article. Will crisis plague Netanyahu start a war to save his skin? So a favored tactic of Israeli prime ministers in trouble is to provoke a confrontation, or at least overreact to ensure one develops, and then send in the army. Wars can be expected to unite Israelis behind a failing government and silence opposition while winning uncritical support from Jews overseas and knee-jerk sympathy from Western states. Gaza has served this purpose repeatedly over the past 15 years. Notoriously, Ehud Olmert chose to use Lebanon, a much more challenging arena militarily, to try to prove his mettle in 2006 and rally Israel's population behind his weak government. It did not turn out well for him. Benjamin Netanyahu is an Israeli leader immersed in trouble of both the personal and political kind, far more deeply than his predecessors. He is in the midst of a corruption trial that is not going away and desperately needs to keep himself in power and pass legislation to weaken the courts if he is not to risk ending up in jail. But his so-called judicial overhaul, intended to give his religious extremist allies effective control over the courts, has triggered unprecedented protests across the country. Netanyahu's polling figures have tanked. He will almost certainly lose an election if one were to be called today. In parallel, he faces an unprecedented near mutiny among elite sections of the military, including pilots and experienced reservists who oppose his interference in the judiciary, in part for self-interested reasons. Cook says the Israeli Supreme Court's supposed oversight of their war crimes is the biggest obstacle to bringing them to the dock of the International Criminal Court. But the rebellion in the ranks Netanyahu has provoked is also viewed increasingly as undermining Israel's much-prized deterrence in a hostile region. If that weren't bad enough, Netanyahu needs to endlessly pander to his fascist religious settler partners in the coalition, or his government will almost certainly fail. But the far-right ministers overseeing the police and military administration that dictates life for Palestinians are little more than pyromaniacs determined to set the occupied territories ablaze. That way, the settlers and the army have the pretext to speed up the process of driving Palestinians off their land and herding them into a handful of urban ghettos. As a result, for the first time, the vigorous pro-Israel lobby, especially in the U.S., is finding reason to doubt the legitimacy of an Israeli government. Israel's apologists have been hit by a double whammy of Netanyahu inviting openly religious fascist parties into his coalition and then seeking to give them control over the courts. The lobby was already immersed in the difficult task of smearing the international human rights community for agreeing that Israel qualifies as an apartheid state. And this is Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and the top Israeli human rights organization, B'Tselem, as well. Now it's balking at the job of defending Netanyahu's efforts to turn Israel into a theocratic dictatorship. And behind it all, the Biden administration is unhappy that Netanyahu is making Israel look so obviously undemocratic that Washington's, quote, shared values and eternal bond sermons are sounding more than hollow. Juggling all these problems is testing the ingenuity of even Netanyahu, Israel's longest-serving prime minister and a politician usually ascribed a near mythical talent for holding on to power. In such circumstances, the prospect of war in the next few weeks might look attractive, a danger that has not gone unnoticed by Israeli commentators. Netanyahu's government has already lit fires on the Palestinian, Lebanese, and Syrian fronts. The spark was Israel twice sending its police forces into the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound in occupied Jerusalem 2 weeks ago to beat and humiliate peaceful worshippers during the holy fasting month of Ramadan. Desecration by a self-declared Jewish state of Al-Aqsa, a holy site of huge importance not only to Palestinians but to all Muslims, was a surefire way to affront the Arab world. Almost immediately, there was a revival of Palestinian lone wolf attacks, and there were shootings against Israeli occupation forces in the West Bank. On the broader front, a burst of rockets was fired from Gaza, Lebanon, and Syria, prompting Israel to launch limited airstrikes against its neighbors. However, despite heightened tensions, all sides, including Israel, appeared keen to pull back from the brink. Things have quieted down for the moment, apparently at Netanyahu's insistence. He is reported to have overruled Itamar Ben-Gvir, his far-right police minister, and denied Jewish settlers entry to Al-Aqsa over the remaining days of Ramadan, presumably to stop a repeat of the recent scenes of brutal police violence against worshippers, which, of course, went viral, and which they were beating many men, women, children, and elderly people, beating them with batons and rifle butts and throwing sound grenades and, breaking windows and damaging all kinds of property in the mosque and, firing rubber coated steel bullets. Israel did this in 2021 and it sparked a war with Gaza where they just killed hundreds of people, including dozens and dozens of children. But they go into the Al-Aqsa compound and they brutalize civilians there worshiping. And so still the question remains, might Netanyahu decide in the coming weeks that it works to his advantage to stir things up again? The same pressures dog him. He needs to drive through his judicial overhaul, both to save his own neck and that of his government. This week, he vowed to press on with what he called a clear mandate to fix the judicial system. And essentially what he wants to do is give the government the power to handpick judges and control the Judiciary Selection Committee. And also they have an override clause, which he's trying to ramp through, which essentially with a majority in the Knesset, they can overrule rulings by the Supreme Court. And but the core of the protest movement, from Israel's secular middle classes to its reservists, are not backing down. They're still massing on the streets to stop him. Pulling Israel into another confrontation with the Palestinians or even with neighboring Lebanon could look tempting. It would force the Israeli military to drop its mutinous murmurings and fall into line, however reluctantly. It would also likely divide the protest movement, with some sections demanding unity at a time of national crisis, and the Israel lobby overseas would be pressured back into its usual subservience, presumably. And then, given the key bits of Netanyahu's judicial overhaul could be passed almost as soon as Israel's parliament returns from its Passover recess at the end of this month, he could try to slip through the changes under the cover of war. And that may be why government sources told Israeli media over the weekend, after the Ramadan and Passover holidays had finished, that they will be forced to launch a major military operation. Netanyahu directed his fire at the rebellious reservists, accusing them of eroding Israeli security. Said, when our enemies see the call for refusal, they interpret it as a weakness of our national resilience. He warned that Israel's enemies might take that as an invitation to strike. Appearing to indicate that he may preempt an Arab attack, Netanyahu added, we'll restore deterrence. It'll take time, but it'll happen. I told the previous government not to ruin so much, as we'll have to fix it. But while stoking war sounds simple on paper, carrying through such a plan may prove far trickier. True, Israeli reservists would be unlikely to stay home would there be a call up. The mood of revolt, however, would continue and surely return with a vengeance the moment a needless confrontation has run its course. Further, retired Israeli generals would make it hard for the government to fix the narrative. They would be sure to dominate the headlines during the fighting, suggesting that Netanyahu has engineered a military crisis to solve his domestic woes. Moshe Yaalon, a former defense minister under Netanyahu, as well as a former head of the military, told protesters in Tel Aviv last weekend, I served in the army for many decades, and I did not see behavior as reckless as that of defendant Netanyahu now. Blame for any hostilities would likely fall directly on Netanyahu's shoulders. He is already accused of weakening Israel's standing in the eyes of its neighbors through the internal divisions he has stoked with plans for the judicial overhaul. The point was driven home by Yaalon, who observed of Netanyahu, his obsessive plot to overturn Israel's democracy represents an immediate threat to Israel's security. Our enemies are watching, and our deterrence is waning. Arab leaders have been publicly making the same argument. This week, Saleh al-Arori, the deputy leader of Hamas's political wing, observed that Israel was in an, quote, unprecedented crisis and facing internal disintegration. Arori was part of the Hamas delegation that met Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah to discuss the recent exchange of fire. Added, the resistance axis is gaining momentum and the developments in the region work in its favor. Netanyahu could reasonably expect much worse fallout from a military confrontation of his choosing than Olmert faced after his disastrous 34-day standoff with Hezbollah in 2006. If Netanyahu is likely to struggle to mobilize Israelis in their usual zeal for war, he also faces a region unusually united against him. Netanyahu likes to flaunt his successes in securing the Abraham Accords in 2020, a formal declaration of normalization between Israel and the Gulf states, particularly the UAE and Bahrain. His ultimate hope was to convert Israel into an honorary member of the Sunni fold, luring Saudi Arabia to sign the accords too, and thereby intensify regional coordination against Iran. And of course, I think the Biden administration was very keen on doing this as well. There's even a bill, I believe, that was introduced by the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Bob Menendez, recently, the Democrat. I think he has a Republican co-sponsor as well, where they're still trying to do this sort of air defenses, missile defense integration project, where they're trying to, basically build off of the Abraham Accords to build up some kind of a military alliance. I don't know if they're going to be able to get as far as they would have liked. What they wanted essentially was almost an equivalent to NATO surrounding Iran, using Iran in the place of Russia, and that they were going to use the Abraham Accords to do that by drawing people in with, new business contracts and more military aid for Israel, of course, but all these, they were going to sell all these advanced weapons to, like the UAE, for instance. Um, and they wanted Saudi Arabia, but the fact that Saudi Arabia is normalized with Iran has really thrown a huge wrench into this policy. Not to mention the fact that they're normalizing with Syria now. So this whole plan seems to be pretty much. I mean, I don't know. We'll have to see what their next steps are, but it's been the progress there and what they were trying to do has been severely damaged, which is great. But who knows? Whatever Israel will do will be. Remains to be seen, but it could be bad. But in recent days, Saudi Arabia, the powerhouse of the Sunni Arab world, has shown an unexpected readiness to make peace overtures to its historic Shia-led rivals, especially Iran and Syria, Israel's main regional adversaries. Riyadh is heading moves to welcome Syria back into the Arab League and has signed an agreement over U.S. opposition to bury the hatchet with Iran. A joint statement issued in Beijing said the two countries will act together to benefit regional security. Renewed ties between Riyadh and Tehran may further limit Israel's military room for maneuver in Lebanon, where Iran operates and has aided Hezbollah in building its military strength to deter an Israeli attack. And with the U.S.'s patron prioritizing its energies on weakening Russia and Ukraine and saber-rattling against China, Israel has a good reason to feel more isolated in the region than ever. By any rational assessment, the odds are not stacked in favor of Israel provoking war. But reason may not be the guiding star, especially when Netanyahu is in bed with militant religious extremists like his police minister Itmar Ben-Gvir and the finance and unofficial occupation minister Bezalel Smotrich. And this pair of arsonists want a conflagration with the Palestinians as a way to galvanize Israeli public opinion behind the annexation of the occupied territories. They have the means and motive to keep blowing up the Palestinian arena with the constant risk of widening any confrontation to other fronts by stoking tensions at Al-Aqsa. Netanyahu may conclude that he has more to lose than gain from a war, but he may find himself in one anyway. So essentially, I mean, this is what we've been concerned about on the show, is that the Americans and the Israelis just have no real they don't seem to have any way to adjust to the fact that diplomacy is breaking out. And we've seen this for quite a while. I mean, one of the reasons why Brett McGurk declared the back to basics approach in the Middle East after the withdrawal from Afghanistan was because it became pretty clear shortly after the withdrawal that a lot of these former longtime adversaries were ready to talk with each other. And they presumed that the U.S. really was leaving the region to focus much more in the Pacific and also in Eastern Europe. Which is still true, but the back to basics element was about really staying entrenched in the Middle East and attempting to maintain the status quo and build up the Abraham's Accords. So you have this sort of regional coalition against Iran. And as Ted Snyder always points out, building up a Cold War style blocks between the good guys and the bad guys. And of course, Saudi Arabia was the most important part of that American-Israeli, Sunni Gulf state, tentative alliance against Iran. So now that's all been thwarted. And so what we're seeing, of course, is that the Israelis are preparing to, or at least they could very well provoke a large conflict, especially when you're bombing Lebanon, you're bombing Gaza, you're bombing Syria, you're attacking Iran, carrying out, more covert attacks. There was that recent attempted drone strike in Isfahan, which followed a drone strike that succeeded in the same city against another military facility. Of course, last year we saw a major uptick in the assassinations that the Israelis were carrying out in Iran and some of the covert attacks as well in the nuclear program. And so we may see more of those coming up as well. And so we'll keep an eye on it, and I'll cover more on the escalations and violence in the West Bank against the Palestinians, especially here next week.
All right, Connor, thank you so much for that update. Everybody, thank you so much for tuning in. We'll be back with more shows next week.
Thanks, Cal. Thanks, everybody.